Welcome back to the channel, folks, and to the second of our painting tutorials for the new German Bulge releases. This tutorial is going to be focusing on the Hummel and the Hornisse kits. I'm going to show you two different camo approaches, both of them being soft edge 3-tone, and I'm going to go through the assembly because both of these kits are made off the same sprue, so there is potential for things to go a little bit wrong if you don't get the right little components in the right place. And folks, I've recently done a tutorial for Jagdpanthers. You can see them in the picture here. There's a link at the end of the video to that, as well as a photo dump with some comparison shots between the new plastic kits and the old resin kits. And of course, you can use these camos, these painting techniques on any type of late war German vehicle, folks. So let's get started. Here are the tools we will use for assembly, folks. We've got some proper modelling snippers here, clippers if you want to call them that. These are very thin. That means you can get into all the little spaces on the sprues and it will reduce breakage of parts and reduce the amount of flex that you push into the sprue itself when you're using a thicker snipper, because that can also break parts. And then I use a fairly blunt modelling knife, nothing too sharp, and I'll be using two types of glue. The typical thick kind of glue we've got here, liquid type in a bottle from Tamiya, and also for smaller parts the very thin glue, but only where strength is not so much of an issue. And also, folks, the instructions that come with the pack, the Getting Started booklet. The Hornisse and the Hummel share many components, but there are certain key components that are different, so make sure you're using the guide to spot the different parts. Here I'm just taking a moment to find them all, put them on the guide itself so I can be sure, and that way if you're prepared you can't go wrong, folks, and if you do go wrong it will probably make quite a mess. Dry fitting is an important part of the assembly process. It helps you understand how the kit goes together and if there are any stages that need to be carried out in advance of others, and help you understand if there's any particularly challenging fits where you need to spend a bit more time manoeuvring the pieces and perhaps keeping them clamped together. Using the thick cement, I'm going to assemble the lower hulls as a starting point for both the Hummel and the Hornisse. They're the exact same in that respect, and then I'm going to be holding the front in place until the glue has set up sufficiently to get a nice tight bond. Next, I'm going to be adding the storage bins to the inside of the hull sides. It's very difficult to get these bins in after the hull sides have been glued into place. And I'm using the very thin cement, which has got a good capillary action. I'm going to put the piece onto the hull and then run the brush along the edge. The capillary action draws it into the gap between the piece and the side and gives a nice firm bond. This next stage is a bit tricky and is the most difficult part of putting these kits together. Assemble the gun and the mount and glue it in place. Make sure it's pointing nice and straight and even and is at the right elevation for you. And then we're going to glue the sides in place. We're going to work very quickly so that the glue hasn't got a chance to completely set. Now I am attaching the front plate and I'm going to use the extra thin cement for this, folks. I'm going to set it in place and then draw the brush down the joints. This is a section that you could get quite an ugly result if you use too much of the thick cement, and this thin cement doesn't leave very much in the way of any marks on the plastic itself. And now this is where we have to very carefully start pushing, pulling, coaxing all these little parts together to get a really tight bond. The you won't be able to get a perfect bond as soon as you put that front plate on. You'll need to move the side plates a little, squeeze them together. You've got a bit of leeway with what happens at the back, much more than you do with what's going on at the front, because that's going to be the most obvious place that gaps will stand out. Where needed, I will also use a little bit more of the very thin cement where a gap needs a bit of extra bonding to keep it nice and tight. So you will have to hold things in place for a little bit whilst the glue starts to properly set up. Just follow the same process with the Hummel as we did with the Hornisse there, making sure you have the right parts, in particular the front plate, because if you get that on the wrong hull, you're going to have difficulties in attaching the correct gun. That's us ready to start painting, so I have given everything a coat of Tamiya Dark Yellow 2. It's a nice bright dark yellow, which is very suitable for late war, but generally speaking I would use it for all of my German vehicles. Here, by the way, I have kept the tracks separate because they very neatly fit into the very open lower hulls of these kits, and that will make painting a lot easier. So I'm starting with dark brown. That's going to be the first camo colour, going to be thin lines on the Hornisses and blotches on the Hummels. Let's start with the Hummels. So you're seeing this a little bit speeded up, so it looks as though I'm really firing this on, but I'm actually taking my time. I'm not trying to do absolutely full coverage in one pass, because that way you're going to flood the surface and get what I call hot spots, little areas that actually end up looking shiny, and it's very hard to get rid of that look. It can take a bit of practice to get the kind of shapes that you want, so don't be frustrated if you're new to it and it doesn't work out correct straight away. I have two airbrushes, folks, and I keep the remainder of the base colour in one airbrush, so if I don't like what I'm doing in the camo stage, in the blotch or squiggly line stage, I can easily do a quick correction and then go back, carry on again with the camo colour. Make sure your camo blotches are not too big. You've still got to add the green after you've added the brown here, and if the brown is too big, then you're going to have to put less green on to be able to still see a sufficient amount of the base colour, and then everything starts to get all out of balance. I have been asked to explain what size of needle I use, what type of airbrush I use, from viewers on previous videos. Well, I don't have a great deal of wisdom to share with you on that point, folks. I don't know what size of needle this airbrush has got. I got it free with a compressor. For me, the most important thing is being able to use what you've got and not reaching for the stars. Remember, folks, you're painting model kits here, you're not actually airbrushing a painting. What we're doing here is going to have subsequent layers of varnish, of washes, of weathering over the top of it, which is really going to alter the final look. So things do not have to be perfect, and even though I know this annoys a lot of people, you don't have to spend an absolute fortune on an airbrush to get good results. You just have to understand how to use it, which means practice. Now on to the Hornisse and the much more difficult task of airbrushing thin lines. Now, Tamiya Red Brown is a colour I like, but it's also a colour that causes me a lot of problems. I seem to always struggle to get it thinned correctly. So my lines here are a little bit thicker than what I actually want, but otherwise I'm happy enough with the shape. Now, once again, we're not trying to put the entire line down in one pass. If we've got good control and the paint is thinned correctly, we can do a pass and then another pass. That will give us a a nice soft grade between the edge and the dark yellow, and also stop any hot spots. As with the larger blotches, you still have to plan your camo shapes as much as possible, thinking where is the green going to go, and making sure there is enough base colour going to be left under the blotches, otherwise things could get a bit too soft and merge together too much on the final result. Once I firmed up the shapes, I'm going through and adding just little sprays, little blobs, little spurs to the edges of the lines to help firm up the final look. Now we're on to the greens, and I'm using Tamiya Nato green here, folks. You can also use olive green or dark green, and they get darker in that order. I find the dark green a little bit too dark, which makes it a little bit indistinct against the dark brown, especially once you start washing and weathering, but the choice is yours, folks. Starting with the Hornisses, I am applying some thin lines, and I can see straight away I'm getting much more control over this than I did with the brown. So putting the lines on fine, not trying to do everything in the one pass, and then trying to build up the camo shapes, the overall pattern that I'm looking for, which has got the right balance between the two camo lines and the base colour. With the Hummels, we can start to add some sort of really attractive blotches here if we can get the right shapes and we can get the right balance between all the camos, so that the overall result is going to be three-tone. As always, don't try to get all the paint on in one pass. You're going to create the shape and then come back, firm up the shape, and then even then potentially after that come back with a few touch up around the edges so that you get the perfectly defined shape that you're looking for that part of the tank. The airbrushing is done, and we're on to the pen wash, and I'm using an acrylic wash here from MIG Ammo. I mix it up in the palette with some water so that I'm not using it straight out of the bottle, and I've got a very high level of control. I'm using a very thin brush, long thin brush, and you can see how much control I've actually got here, folks, how this is just going perfectly where I want it to be, especially in those long panels. It's not flowing over. Now I should point out that I have gloss varnished this to get the maximum amount of capillary action on the surface so that it doesn't get drawn into a matte surface. Now this paint is so easy to work with, folk. If you've never pen washed, or you don't want to use enamels because of the smell and the thinners and having to work with something other than just water, then I strongly recommend this product to you. It's one that I'm going to use pretty much in all circumstances, I think, going forward. With all pen washes, there will be a degree of touch-up required, where you have to lift off any paint, any wash which has not landed in the right place or it's drifted off, flooded the surface a little bit. Well, you can do this with water and a damp brush when you're using this acrylic pen wash. Now, why use a pen wash? Well, it allows you to get the shade exactly where you want it, which means that the surface doesn't darken down. If you apply a wash all over the surface, then the end result is going to be very dark, whereas here we're creating defining lines, which we're then going to add highlights to, which is going to give us a great deal of shape and an increased brightness, not a reduced brightness. I recommend you work a certain area of the tank at one time, get the wash on, and then do the tidy up, then move on to another area and do the tidy up, and so on and so on. You don't have to let this wash dry in the way that you maybe would with an enamel paint, but the quicker you start tidying it up, the brighter the final look will be. I wait till the wash is touch dry, which isn't very long with this acrylic product, and then I start highlighting, and I start by working all the edges, as you can see here, inside and out folks, because that'll give it a nice sharp edge on the crew compartment there. I'm using Iraqi sand. That gives a nice clear edge that isn't overly bright, but it will allow you to define all the shapes of the panels and the outside edges of the kit. Just like with the pin wash, this is quite a time consuming process folks, but it's the only way you're going to get really sharp edges, especially in the internal detail, such as internal panel lines and around hatches and such likes. And dry brushing is of course a very popular process, but this allows you to take it up one level, so you're going to get sharp, bright results that doesn't give it an overall dusty appearance. When working the smaller areas of detail, such as like the tie downs and little components such as headlights and so on, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush just so I can get some finer results. When I've applied the highlighting on the edges, I've not absolutely outlined every single millimetre of every edge. I've left it a little bit broken because that's going to be the start of the chipping process. So I'm going to use a very fine brush to draw some fine chips, little dots, little lines, little squiggles across the surface. It helps to give that weathered look and also define hatches and so on, and quite importantly to break up large panels such as you find on the gun shield and on the sides of the vehicle. Don't go over the top here folks, it's very easy to put on too much and you end up with something that looks like it should be in a scrapyard rather than a vehicle which has just had a bit of hard living. The next stage of the chipping is to add some German camel black brown, some very small amounts into some, not all, but some of those little scratch lines and little chip dots that we have created already. So the darker areas represent exposed metal and the lighter chips represent just surface wear. Try and keep those black German camel black brown lines inside the Iraqi sand scratches. It's tricky, it's not easy, you need a very fine point on your brush, but the overall effect is going to be to soften the look of the vehicle, like the larger areas, but at the same time help bring smaller areas such as hatches and panel edges into focus. Remember folks, if you've got a light panel edge on a vehicle which is overall basically light, and you start putting dark scratches along those edges, just little dots here and there, it helps to give it a bit more shape because the darker edge will stand out strongly against the lighter background. You can see on the Hummel here how these flat, big flat panels, I've got a lot more going on now, a bit more depth, a bit more of a patina getting built up on them. Now for the last stage of the weathering, I'm going back to the dark brown acrylic pin wash to use that to create some streaks. This is nearly finished folks, this is kind of like the last stage before varnishing. Now I'm going to be adding little dots of this wash, and then with a clean brush I'm going to be drawing the lines down to create streaks. You know, here I'm running these down off the tie down points because they would be the areas that would perhaps gather a little bit of dirt and be a focal point for capillary action, and then try to get really straight lines that follow gravity. That's the most important aspect here, and then we have to start working these lines after we've put them on. You see, I'm not scared to use my finger here folks. If the finger is going to just clearly draw everything away, then I'm quite happy to do so. Otherwise I'm going to use my brush and carefully control how much moisture is on it so that I don't just create a pool of wash instead of a nice sharp line, but also if it's too dry I'm not going to soften down that line. You have to work these lines quickly but not too much. So I'm using a dark streaking colour here. I could use a lighter colour, but experience has shown me that on the lighter background it just softens everything down. Now that might be what you want to achieve, but I feel on a vehicle like this, a few dark lines just helps create that weathered look and preserves all the work we've put into the chipping and the airbrushing itself. You just need a few lines, folks, to give you that weathered streaky look. If you go over the top, then it might end up looking too streaky, get a bit of a zebra type appearance, and you start to lose all of the balance in the finished look. So let this get touch dry again, and you're ready for your final coat of matte varnish. And that's you done, folks. You can obviously stick the tracks on once you are ready to apply the matte varnish. I will be covering how to paint the tracks in a separate video. Now, at the end of this, there's going to be some pictures for you to look at, including some other vehicles painted in a similar way, and there's going to be some side-by-side comparison pictures too of these new plastic kits compared to the previous resin kits that were released in version 4. So I hope you liked that, folks. I hope it was useful for you. If you've got any questions, just stick them down in the comments. You'll find the paints I've used down there too. Thanks for watching, guys. Thanks to all the subscribers that are out there. If you'd like to subscribe, hit the button and it will help YouTube bring this kind of content to people who enjoy this aspect of our hobby. And if you hit the bell button, that means we'll definitely see you folks on the next one.